Well, welcome everybody. Hello. Welcome to Dimensions of the Self, Awakening to the Inner Collective 2025. So I'm very excited to be here and for us to be all doing this class and taking this journey together. And when I give the class, I take it right along with all of you. And I'm very excited about the potential outcomes and seeing where we can all go together. And certainly I'll do my bit, but the idea really of these kind of courses that I've been giving lately is for us to all really make the course happen together through engagement with each other, um, deep and sincere contemplation of the topics that are presented. I've taught Chinese medicine now for 40 years. I really began teaching it I was lecturing on it a bit before that, but I really began teaching it in 1985. So this is the 40th anniversary, really, 2025 of me being a teacher in Chinese medicine. And I teach many different sorts of things. In my clinical integration class and pulse classes, I teach very deep physiology. That physiology comes up very practically in pulse, tongue, and eye diagnosis. And I allude to that and teach that when I teach herbal formulas, particularly my class on herbs. And all of that is very practical in terms of learning a deep, deep physiology in Chinese medicine to really always understand the human being and the gross, subtle, and very subtle dimensions of the self, and to be able to correlate signs like pulse, tongue, eye, tenderness in the shoe points, symptoms, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors with each other to paint a very elaborate picture of where the patient is in their life on their journey through life in relationship to their life curriculum and the issues involved with the relative stasis in manifesting that destiny or the degree of progression in that regard and how to aid the person in the gross physical and more subtle psychological soul level and very subtle spiritual dimensions of the self. The nature of this particular class is it's a bit it's less technical. It's less technical. And it has very, very much more to do with the development of the practitioner in relationship to their own understanding of themselves and the forces, the different parts of the self, the motivations of those parts, and the forces that act upon those parts and the values expressed by those different parts of the self. Because it turns out really that we're one humanity having essentially the same human experience in relationship to our existence. Now, of course, people live in different countries and have different cultures and different belief systems and at relative level of freedom and economic opportunity. All that's certainly true. But in relationship to the fundamental thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations, um, that we can all experience in relationship to the fundamental striving of the human soul to reach union and live a life of dignity free from oppression, and the experience we have in relationship to the constraints of those goals. We're all having a very similar experience. So the nature of this class should be deeply profoundly developmental for those who engage with it. And I encourage you all to contemplate very deeply, to come to the discussion groups with questions, to engage with me around them. And the goal of the class is that the different identified dimensions of the self, which I have elaborated over the course of my career, but in print, in detail, in my deepening perspective text, the goal of this class is that one won't have just merely an intellectual understanding, but a philosophical context for understanding these dimensions, and not merely a philosophical, intellectual understanding of context, but a deeply lived daily relationship to all of the dimensions of the self. So as they express themselves as values and motives within us, we know what voice in the head is speaking, what its inclination is, what its motive is, the degree to which acting upon that impulse, that awareness, that motive, that value will lead to a wholesome or a relatively unwholesome outcome, and increased freedom of choice around not what we're experiencing, but around what we're expressing in relationship to our experience. So welcome to the class. It's good to be here. I'm very excited about this. And here we go. Well, it's been my experience over the course of my clinical career. I've been in Chinese medicine since 1980 and practicing for over 40 years now. I've done 95,000 clinical sessions. I was always wondering if I was going to make it to 100. And if I live long enough, I will. I still see patients one day a month and a couple other times, a few other patients a month. So it's been my experience both clinically and in my experience as a teacher and in my experience just with people I know and observing society, that most people know very, very little about themselves. Their attention is confined by ego to a very small and very personal dimension of their experience that generally they experience as an existential knot, a problem to be solved, a history and past that has to overcome, that causes people to have an inherently to experience life with an implicit, both conscious and unconscious sense of inherent limitation of what's possible. And generally, whatever they imagine is possible or could be possible is always at some future point, but never right now, because right now they're still working on a problem that they've got. So, to the degree a person is unawake, the most significant input into who they are in any moment is their history, which means that they have a completely conditioned habitual view, a significantly conditioned habitual view of themselves and of life and of others and their motivations and of what's possible. And to the degree a person is awakened, the greater future that they intuit is possible explodes into the present through them, and the human being becomes a vehicle for the liberation of that imminent potential that they intuit. We don't wait for it to come. We intuit a higher and a deeper potential, and we bring it here and we live it now. And we look through the eyes of that potential here and now, not waiting for anything to change. We recognize that our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our souls, our memories, our capacities, exactly as they are, right here and right now, precisely as they are, makes us the absolute perfect vehicle now for living with integrity up to the highest, deepest, most profound potential that we're able to intuit. So the outcome of most people's lives is determined by a very partial conclusion that they drew about their experience based on very limited life experience when they were very young and had an immature mind. Most people, the outcome of their life, if they live to be 100, is the outcome of their relationships, the quality of giving they were able to express, the quality of love, the quality of depth of knowledge and understanding of who they are and why they're here, is generally determined by a conclusion they drew, sometimes pre-verbally, and in most people at the very latest by the time they were 18 to 21. And to be honest with you, most people by the age of 6 have a fundamental worldview that screens from their awareness all other possibility that doesn't cohere with it, and only lets into awareness everything that confirms the position that they took as a compensatory mechanism in the face of some trauma at some very early age. It is my experience that most of us are compelled to act by forces and motives that we're unaware of and don't understand. And the purposes of this course is to make them explicit. So class goals are to have a non-abstract relationship to all the significant dimensions of the self, to institute free will and choice as the foundation of our development. For almost all people, development only occurs in their life up to 18 to 21 years old and then stops. And development only, for most people, development only occurs as far as it is genetically based and biologically driven. And that'll get most people up through puberty. And most people don't become an adult, but one can become an adult and develop right up to 18 to 21 years old, and then it just stops for most people. For most people, the main forces of their development are genetic, biological, and cultural, meaning that as we grow up, there are genetic forces driving our evolution. Nobody has to collaborate with the evolutionary impulse for their lungs to develop, or for their ectoderm to turn into eyes, ears, nose, mouth, right? And nobody has to collaborate consciously with and creatively with the evolutionary impulse to be able to have the capacity to ride a bike emerge, or the capacity to do algebra emerge. I mean, all that's going to happen in time, and as long as a person lives in a culture that has bicycles, and someone will teach them, or has math and algebra, and they get exposed to it, at a certain stage of development, they can start doing algebra or geometry, right? So there are genetic biological forces at work that compel most people. And then there's cultural forces. From the moment of our first breath, we're told who we are and what's expected to us. And as we gain language, that is completely programmed into us in terms of the superego. So who a person is when they are unconscious and living life habitually from reflexively and impulsively is that people are expressing biological imperatives, which mostly have to do with survival and reproduction. Survival is the first chakra, reproduction is the second chakra. And as we gain language, culture starts telling us, you're a girl, you're a boy, you're a Jew, you're a Muslim, you're a Christian, you're a Zoroastrian, you're this, you're that. In our family, we do this. You're an American, you're a Dutch person, a good Dutch girl does this, a good Dutch boy does that. And that's programmed into us. And one of the goals of this class is to awaken to our highest and deepest motives and the best parts of ourselves, the very best parts of ourselves, and to cohere and coalesce the very best part of ourself until we recognize that it is actually a self, an authentic self, and to make an informed choice based on our experience of that very best part of ourself, to put our stake in the ground at the root of who and what we are, to give ourselves to that, and to establish free will and choice as the basis of our development in a way that purifies biological and culturally conditioned motives that are unwholesome. There are some biological motives, survival is a wholesome motive, generally speaking. It's good to survive. If you go walking through the woods and all the hair goes back up on the rear of your neck and you hear twigs breaking, it's probably a good thing to look around. And we learn a lot from culture that's good too. It's good, green means go, yellow means slow down, red means stop. But there are a lot of biological imperatives that are unwholesome, especially when they don't evolve beyond first, second, and third chakra expressions, which are I want what I want when I want it, regardless of the consequences. And there are an awful lot you may have noticed that has been taught to us by culture, which is utter nonsense and was formulated in the infancy to earliest childhood of myths and superstitions, formulated in the infancy of the human condition. And a lot of those beliefs just don't have any carry weight anymore. So in this class, another goal is to come to understand the price paid for agency and communion. What that means is having put our stake in the ground to become an individual who's giving themselves to the very best part of themselves and has recognized who and what they are as the best part of themselves and has decided to give their life to that. When we put our stake in the ground for that to exercise free will, there are consequences both within us and outside of us, because as our values evolve and change, our relationships to ourselves and the different motives in our head begin to change. Certain voices that we felt we had no freedom of choice in relationship to, all of a sudden are recognized as being unwholesome and less than. And then we grow increasingly less interested in them, having recognized them for what they are. And just as our relationship to our inner collective changes, our relationship to our outer collective changes. And our relationships begin changing in life to people, to other people. And you've all experienced this. I'm sure you've all seen it, but I mean, in your friends and in clinic, that, a partner in a marriage joins a book club or starts taking dance lessons or takes a yoga class. And within a couple of years, the marriage ends because one person is developing and growing and reading and learning and maturing in parts of themselves, and the other person won't change and doesn't want to change. So there is a price paid to become an individual. And out of becoming an individual, we experience, interestingly, deeper and deeper communion. The more of an individual we become, the deeper and deeper our communion, because agents, the kind of agency I'm talking about is not being a rugged, an old West, rugged, my way or the highway, I'm going to go it alone individual, but an individual rooted in the recognition of who and what they are. And if I am deeply rooted in what is putting me here, and to the degree I have a profound relationship to that, I will be in deep communion with anybody else who has the same recognition, independent of whatever creation myth they might be framing that in. There'll be an immediate recognition between people who've awoken to the ground of their own being and as emptiness, and recognize themselves as both emptiness and luminosity. So by putting our stake in the ground to give ourselves to the best part of ourselves, all the forces between heaven and earth in support of that are going to line right up to support us and put the wind in our back. And all the forces of stagnation and maintaining the status quo and resistance, both within us, which will manifest as fear and rage and sometimes lost deep primordial emotions. And we will can experience the same resistance on the outside from culture as we take a deep stand for authenticity within ourselves. And the basis of this teaching is that when we put the stake in the ground, all the forces within that support and out that support, and all the forces within and without to maintain the status quo and create cynicism and doubt within are going to arise. And then we have a choice to make. And making that choice is going to teach us everything we need to know about ourselves in terms of understanding the forces of resistance and the motive toward union in each human being, and the force of resistance in relationship to it. And all of the Chinese syndrome patterns that talk about lack of communication and between parts of the cells and stagnations and moving stagnations, those are all physiological metaphors for a person's relationship to the upright energies. And we can call them Jing, Qi, and Shen. And Chinese medicine tends to functionalize it a lot. In the West, we tend to look at people as symptoms in Western medicine without seeing the person. And in Chinese medicine, we can look at everybody as flows of energy without really seeing the person and understanding the very human experience and the very human dimension behind the dynamics that are going on. So in this class, you should come to have a truly non-abstract relationship to the dynamics of human development by developing yourself and understanding that yourself. And the underwriting principle of this class is to know the patient, we know the self. The self, capital S, which is the one self, which we can express dualistically as emptiness and luminosity, which the first 3 classes are on. Well, there's this class, which is the introductory class. So the second, third, and fourth class are on emptiness and luminosity, putting a deep basis of practice and how to practice every day and how to look at these fundamental forces while we go through the complexity of all of the constructed parts of the self. So we're also going to know the patient through knowing the small self, which is to understand the motivations of the ego and the superego and the different relative dimensions. So we're going to break the self down into the absolute dimensions of the self and the relative dimensions of the self and look at the relationship between them. And what I'm doing now at this point in my life is I've always taught this material. I just taught last year, beginning September 2024, a 10-month, 12-session class on shadow work in Chinese medicine. And that was taken from a weekend course and that a 3-day class, and that 3-day class was essentially what would have been 1 or 2 slides in my clinical integration 2-year class. So I blew that up into a weekend and then a 10-month course. This Dimensions of the Self, this 10-month course you're taking, were 2 slides in my shadow course and in my clinical integration class. So I'm blowing these dimensions way up. And I feel, frankly, that taking the Dimensions of the Self class, the shadow class, which I'll give again next September, and then the clinical integration class, which I have every intention, if my health holds up. I just turned 67 a couple days ago. You can't take anything for granted. So I intend to teach this class, the shadow class once more, and the clinical integration class once more. And I think those 3 would be, as far as I know, the most comprehensive teaching in-depth medicine that a person could receive. Certainly, at least within the context of Chinese medicine. So and profoundly and deeply integrated. So one of the bases of this course, the deep inspiration of the class, is very much the Bodhisattva vow. So I suggest you all read that. Perhaps I'll post it on the class page. And the line from that vow that struck me so deeply is one of the first lines in the vow, and it's, "May I be the doctor and the medicine." And it takes a lot to become a doctor. You know, it takes, you have to go through a tremendous hazing called public education, and then go to a few graduate schools and spend a lot of time and a lot of money in Chinese medicine to become the doctor. But becoming the doctor is something you do on the day you pass your final licensing exam. And becoming the medicine, there will be no end to. There will be no end to. Becoming the doctor is finite and relatively easy. Becoming the medicine is really a contemplation that blows open the heart and the mind and calls the practitioner to a profound reckoning, at least in my experience, of the obligation to root out within my own self and within oneself every fundamental contradiction, to forgive everyone who needs to be forgiven, to apologize to everybody that needs an apology, and to remove every construct and every belief and every behavior that is unwholesome and in any way impedes the expression of the realization of the self as love and as light, as care. The contemplation of what it takes to become the medicine causes potentially the heart to break open to experience a care of absolutely infinite magnitude, so that we become to start paying attention in life with the same care that a mother would listen to her newborn infant with, so that the mother is sleeping at night and the father is sleeping in bed and the baby's in the cradle next to the bed or perhaps sleeping between them. And even though the parents are asleep because, as you know, they're completely and utterly exhausted, in their deepest, most profound sleep, they're still listening to see if the baby's breathing. And this bodhisattvic quality of care begins to become exercised toward one's own self as we start making discriminations within ourselves, sorting out the voice from the soul that is speaking to us about the next step in our life's curriculum. And we begin to extend that inner listening externally, the bodhisattva, toward everything, toward nature, and toward everything and toward everyone. Recognizing the fundamentally unvictimized view that being a healer and having given my life to healing signifies that I didn't have to come back. And the fact that I did come back was a conscious choice, and my agreement in this incarnation is that I chose to come back for the privilege of easing the suffering of others and being the tool of their waking up and their own growing up, and becoming the vehicle for their own transformation and the end of their own suffering, so they too could become vehicles for that, for themselves and for everything and everyone around them. And that the fundamental agreement for coming back is that I would come back regardless of what I experienced in this life, and I'd be willing to endure whatever I had to endure for the privilege of being able to be the vehicle for the other's end of suffering. So that's the basic bodhisattvic orientation of the teaching. So my teaching has three faces, which are all faces of, they're all one thing. And these are integral, evolutionary, and spiritual. Integral, which is a term coined by Jean Gebser and Sri Aurobindo. Jean Gebser in the 1940s and Aurobindo earlier than that. Aurobindo is the founder of integral yoga. They didn't know about each other when they coined this term. But Aurobindo by integral yoga meant a yoga, a practice that leaves no significant self behind. And in terms of practicing integral medicine, it means that we strive to practice a medicine that leaves no significant dimension of the self behind. And to that degree, if we are going to leave no significant dimension of the self behind in the patient, we have to be awakened to all the significant dimensions of ourselves and in our own self, so they're non-abstract, and have a lived relationship to them. And to the degree we know them in ourselves, and to the degree we have a measure of victory in relationship to all these dimensions of the self. And that victory looks like unifying them all into one whole self. And in that self, capital S, each part brings the best part of itself to the self and assumes a proportionate role within the self, so that no unwholesome part of the self, like the ego, for instance, assumes the greatest part of our attention or the greatest amount of our attention. So it merely means that we awaken to all the dimensions of the self and the ego, the superego, for instance, all which are parts of the self that most of us are significantly and most significantly identified with. Those parts of the self still exist and they still do their job, but they move to the side and take a proportionate presence within the self, while parts of the self that that may be relatively abstract to us, even if we've read about them or think about them some, like the soul or the conscience or the authentic self or emptiness, all of a sudden take a much greater part of the self because they're just so much less constrained by soul identification with ego. So the evolutionary dimension of the teaching just recognizes an inherently unlimited context for development of all the parts of the self. So evolutionary just means the recognition of a context of development without end. The traditions all recognized enlightenment as the end of development. You developed till you got enlightened, and when you were enlightened, you didn't have to come back anymore, and you were done. And that was it. And once you were enlightened, there was nowhere else to go. And that is because what we generally speak of as enlightenment is a mythic construct formulated during the Axial Age, 500 BC and after, for several hundred years, when the great spiritual texts were written in Taoism and Buddhism and Confucianism and Hinduism and Christianity, much later Christianity, and then much later the Muslim religion. The idea of God and the idea of enlightenment are mythic. So they need some updating. They need some updating what we might mean by those terms in the 21st century. Appreciating myth symbolically, but having seen through myth, the literal interpretation of myth. And spiritual means we recognize the primacy of spirit, and we recognize in our medicine and in this view that I'm teaching, it's essentially a non-dual absolute context for experience. So we're used to looking at the one through the eyes of the many. So Buddhism looks at the one, and Christianity looks at the one, and the Muslim religion and the Hebrew religion and the Lutherans versus the some other form of Methodists look at it this way, and Lutherans look at it that way, and Catholics look at it this way, and Reformed Jews and Hasidic Jews look at it this way, and we're used to looking at the one through the eyes of the many. And here we balance that, integrally balance the view of the one through the eyes of the many by contemplating what is the perspective of the one on the many, not what is the perspective of the many on the one, but through the eyes of the one, what do the many look like? And that many is the inner collective of the dimensions of the self, or the parts of the self that we're looking at. People call them parts, and it's all right to refer to them as parts. I just find dimensions a little more 4D, a little more alive. A part sounds to me like a part of a carburetor or a part of a pocket watch, or, you know, and dimension to me much better expresses what we're talking about in terms of the inner collective. So we recognize the primary as spirit. Chinese medicine, everyone's fascinated with qi, 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 qi this and qi that, and qi this and qi that. Well, qi just means capacity. And it's great to do qigong. I've been practicing qigong since 1980, and I practice it every day. We want capacity. Believe me, as a 67-year-old, I would love to have 30%, 50%, or 100% more capacity. So qi is important, qi is great, but ultimately, when to me, the word qi means capacity. The capacity, like liver qi means the capacity of the liver to fulfill its function. Kidney qi is the capacity of the kidneys to fulfill their function. The amount of qi in a relationship between two and more things is the capacity of that dynamic to cohere and fulfill its purpose. So I understand qi as capacity. I'm much more interested in spirit as consciousness awakening to recognize itself as the motive force of the universe, and recognize itself as light, and recognize itself as the motive toward clarity, and recognize itself as love as the fundamental motive of universal development. So putting these three together, we're looking at the development of all the parts of the self integrally, with no inherent limitation, forever without end, as an expression of love, as an expression of light. And that's the fundamental context of the teaching. So there are 5 integral imperatives. Waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up, and opening up. Waking up has to do with state attainment. States come and go. So if you think of the Sheng cycle, it's a cycle of seasons, and those seasons are outside of us are the daily light cycle and seasonal change, and the hourly Chinese clock over a 24-hour cycle and over a 365-day cycle. So when qi moves outside of us, there's weather. When qi moves inside of us, there's emotion, there's thoughts, there's feelings, and there's sensations. And each of the 5 elements has its feelings, thought, emotions, and sensations, right? So starting with water, we have fear and anger, and joy and sorrow, and worry and neediness, and grief and longing. And we have wet, and we have wind, and we have cold and wet, and we have wind, and we have hot, and we have damp, and we have dry. And states just come and go. And a person can experience a state in 1 second, and 1 second later be experiencing any other state. You all know that you can be in the depths of despair, and a second later feel ecstatic. You can be depressed, and a second later feel happy, right? It can just change. State experience can change in an instant. And the nature of state experience is that people think whatever state they're experiencing, they project it forward and backward in time, and they think that's how they always felt and how things will always be. And then it shifts, and then they have the same thing about the next state they're experiencing. So that's state experience. And most people their state experience is gross waking life. And only when they're capable of childhood infantile fantasy, which is wish fulfillment, and they have dreams. And their wish fulfillment, sexual fantasies, wishing they won the lottery, fantasizing about how they're going to tell their boss off, all that stuff is infantile wish fulfillment. That's none of that I mentioned is any different than when I was 4 and I'd imagine that my parents would buy me the toy that was being advertised on TV. I want it, right? And then you imagine and you fantasize that you have it. So most people have their attention focused their whole lives on the body as a body self, and they experience the subtle dimension of themselves only in infantile fantasy, wish fulfillment, and in dreams. And in dreams. And waking up involves shifting attention off of the gross material parts of ourselves onto the more subtle dimensions of the self, and evolving higher capacities to imagine not just that I get something to satisfy an immediate desire in a childhood sort of way for instant gratification, but I start to imagine a better future for myself and everything and everyone, and then begin to behave like it's already here, recognizing no obstacles in the way. That's waking up. And we can wake up to increasingly deeper and deeper and higher state experiences within ourselves. But one can, and this is a source of great pain and great confusion in the postmodern era, and I think always has been probably, at least for the last few thousand years, is one can be awake to a very high degree of state experience and transmit deep and profound state experience to others very quickly. I've known teachers who, if you were around them 10 seconds, you'd start to feel your heart exploding in your chest. And they would just transmit love. And they stole money and they slept with their female students and the wives of their male students. So state experience has nothing to do with elevation of worldview necessarily. That's why that explains why women go to South America to do ayahuasca ceremonies with, in quotes, shamans, some of whom are authentic shamans down there, and get raped. Because state experience has nothing to do necessarily with ethical development. Nothing to do with ethical development. And there's been a lot of confusion in the West since the 1950s and 60s when we started studying the Eastern Dharma and the teachings of South America, like in Don Juan. There's been a lot of and African teachings, a lot of confusion, because we assumed the fact that people could induce high state development meant that they were at a high stage of development, and nothing could be further from the truth necessarily. No necessary relationship. If you learn nothing else in this class but the distinction between state and stage development, you'd probably have gotten your money's worth if you look deeply enough into it. So waking up is an imperative to be able to shift attention off the gross dimensions of the self and forge an ever-deepening relationship to the subtle dimensions of the self, to become a whole self. It's important. But the next is growing up, and growing up is stage attainment, and stages don't come and go. You learn to ride a bicycle, You can always ride a bike. You learn to do algebra. The rest, once you've learned geometry, the rest of your life, you have that capacity, unless you develop a neurodegenerative disorder or get brain damage from traumatic injury, you're never going to lose the capacity. Growing up is stages. Stages are stages of worldview, and those have been mapped and they're predictable. You can go from one state to any other state in a second, in the blink of an eye, but stages always go in order, so they have great predictive validity. Great predictive validity. There's a few hour window with a cat, and if it's not exposed to horizontal lines during that day or two of neural development, it will never see horizontal lines again the rest of its life. And the rest of its life, it'll just walk off a table and fall because it won't see an edge. Similarly, there are developmental stages that occur within us, and these are stages of worldview, and they're stages of value systems, and a person needs to be exposed to them. A person needs to be exposed to these stages in order to go through them, and they have to occur in order. You can never skip a stage. You can go through a stage that others have lived through and mastered relatively quickly because the groove has been laid down in culture and in consciousness to do it, but you can't skip that stage. There's like 700 or 600 pages in my Green Deepening Perspective book outlining the stages of human, individual, and cultural development. So we have waking up, which is deeper and deeper state attainment, growing up, which is higher and higher stage attainment. The higher the stage, the greater the care for a whole that is greater than one's own self. The higher the stage, the greater the individual's capacity to cognize complexity and respond to it with nuance in a way that catalyzes wholeness. This is a hierarchy of care. It is a hierarchy of humility and wisdom and all the other named virtues. So waking up, growing up, then cleaning up means doing shadow work. Once we awaken to structures within ourselves. And we all have wounds and miscomprehensions and compensations that exhibit a stasis within us and repressions within us from early stages of development that helped us survive. And when we grow up and we begin to wake up, we begin to consciously put our stake in the ground, to institute consciousness and free will and choice as the foundation of the self, which means we now have to go back through our history and reframe everything that happened and process it, digest it, learn from it, absorb the kernel of truth in all of it, and let go of any belief or behavior or conclusion we've drawn in relationship to any of it, which has unwholesome consequences for the self and for others. And that falls under the auspices of shadow resolution, shadow work. Once we've done these three things, we have to show up, which is engagement. And the basis of that engagement in the context of the teaching I'm giving is the Bodhisattva vow. I'm just thinking here, one of the homeworks I'm going to prescribe for this course is to read the Bodhisattva vow once a day for the 10-month duration of the course. Take less than a minute, 1 minute a day, to just read it 1 minute a day and first thing in the morning, early in the morning as the foundation. And for those really motivated, do it again just before sleep at night. And set the foundation for the day with it. Hold it in mind, hold its precepts in mind throughout the day. And then at the end of the day, look back. How did it read it again? How did I do? What could I have done better? I think it's spontaneous. I've never had anyone, never thought of this before. I mean, I've done it myself, but I've never assigned it. And in this particular class, it seems like a very significant practice to do. And I think that would help set a beautiful context and help maintain the continuity of the class. So showing up means engagement, and the basis of that engagement is the Bodhisattva vow. And then opening up. And opening up, to me, means transparency of motive. What you see is what you get. No hidden agendas. And that transparency is a result of significant rectification of the soul as it strives toward union with everything and everyone in the context of care and love. And so there's just increased transparency because we have part of putting our stake in the ground and instituting our will as the foundation of development is cutting through the ego, and one of the main manifestations of ego is as pretense, self-image. So now we're going to take just a hop, skip, and a jump through the different dimensions of the self. Of course, these are going to be elaborated greatly in each individual class and module. But now we're just going to go right through them relatively quick. So we can talk about absolute and relative dimensions of the self. And we have to make a few philosophical distinctions. It's very important, let me say, to have a philosophical context for life. Most people don't have a philosophical context in life that's consciously held. And whatever philosophical view they do have is just given by culture to them and is believed unquestioningly. And it's really, one of the capacities of postmodernism is to hold many perspectives, many points of view. And it's so powerful to be able to study and understand the world's traditions and then to synthesize a view of them as informed by one's own contemplation of one's own life experience through the eyes of multiple perspectives. So obviously, if you've read my work, you know how important I think it is to have a philosophical view in life. The problem with that is that for many people, the philosophical view that's held is unconscious. And for most, it's abstract, which means even if they can explain it to you, they can talk all about it as an it, but not from and not as what they're talking about. The significant point of this class is for everyone to come out of it being able to speak from and as the different dimensions of the self, to know them so well that in any moment one knows what voice inside is speaking to one, or where the patient or where anyone one is interacting with, what part of the self is coming through, where is it in the body, or what is its motivation? What are the strengths and limits of its view? What are the capacities it brings to the table? And how is it expressed in both wholesome and unwholesome ways? So we talk about absolute and relative dimensions of the self, but when we talk ironically about the absolute dimension of the self, capital S, which means one, we have to talk about two. We have to talk about them relative to each other. We can experience non-duality. So for me, because I've been meditating since 1972, I can just right here, right now, just put my attention on it, and there it is. But as soon as I talk about it, I say, well, it's infinitely spacious and empty, and there's total ease, no inherent sense of limitation, and I could just drop and dissolve into it forever. And there's a passion exploding out of it with no inherent sense of limitation about what's possible to manifest in creation, and pure positivity, and just complete and utter passion with the deepest, most beautiful love and tender care for creation. So I'm not really speaking about something. I'm talking directly from my own experience in real time of these two dimensions in a non-abstract way. And that's the goal of this class. But as Lao Tzu tells us, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. It is speaking. As soon as we speak with a divided mind, and we create duality. We create an observed and an observer. So even though we're talking about the absolute dimensions of the self, we have to talk about two, emptiness and luminosity. Emptiness is infinitely black, infinitely dark, a vacuum, like a black hole out of which no light escapes. And that's one face. And the other face is infinite, blinding, clear, white radiance and light. Just a sun-going supernova, explosion of the sun-going supernova. So emptiness is yin relative to luminosity, which is yang. Emptiness within ourselves is the unconscious. It's all that we're not aware of. It's the infinite ground of being, the infinite depth. And practically speaking, the degree to which any individual has experience with emptiness and has identified emptiness as their own depth and cultivated a lived relationship to it, to the degree emptiness expresses through an individual, it expresses as ease in the face of the unknown. Ease in the face of the unknown. And one of the goals in cultivating a deeply lived relationship to emptiness is a co-collaboration, creative collaboration with the unconscious as the gestating ground of all existence. And generally, as the ego arises in life as light, early in development, and the individual begins to differentiate out of the unconscious, and our eyes and our ears begin to focus, and we begin to orient in time and space to our name, we experience ourselves as separate, and we reach an age where we're terrified of going to bed at night, and we're scared of the monster under the bed. And the monster under the bed is our ego's fear that we will never differentiate, never become an individual, and fear of sleep, because in sleep there is a regression back into emptiness. And as the ego begins to form, it begins to repress emptiness and to hide the empty nature of ourselves. And this creates the illusion that all we are is a separate ego whose body and whose experience is as an individual is separate and unique out in the world in the clear light of day. And we repress the unconscious. The degree to which any human being is in touch with emptiness and has a living relationship to the unconscious, it is presence as a profound and deep ease, which manifests as wisdom, knowledge of emptiness, and an ease in the face of the unknown, and a profound objectivity in the face of fear and the machinations of the mind, all of which begin to occur as objects in the infinite awareness of ourselves as emptiness. And this creates an infinitely deep ocean of context for our experience, which is rooted in being, which is deeply rooted in being, without having to know. And when we're interested in knowing but don't have to know, we can start to experience a profound humility, and the inherent creativity of the unconscious is now not repressed and is unleashed to be interested in what we don't know, and more interested into what we don't know than in what we do know. So this is emptiness as the ultimate pole of earth to heaven's yang, luminosity, the infinite brightness, the light within infinite darkness that is consciousness that makes the choice to become and ignites the potential of Jing as life force, the creative spark, ignites the potential to churn out the RNA and the DNA and churn out the proteins to go from one fertilized cell to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 and onward to become an individual that has light rising up its spine, ascending to higher and higher centers of increased, more complex worldviews and capacities, and deeper care, exploding at the level of the heart as love, exploding at the level of mind as love and as care, and a recognition of oneself as the motive force of creation in the universe, resting in and ultimately exploding out of emptiness. So as grounding in emptiness manifests as ease in the face of the unknown, luminosity manifests within an individual as the authentic self. All the best parts of oneself cohered into a unified whole that experiences the selfless passion to respond to all trials and tribulations and slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune in life in a way that catalyzes the emergence of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Recognizing oneself as the agent of evolution, transformation, and change to more and more wholesome states and stages of being. So these are the absolute dimensions of the self, but there are two of them. Everything I said about them is constructed. And if we contemplate non-duality and as we gain experience with it, those two collapse into each other as an infinitely black, infinitely light, radiance unified beyond the mind, beyond the mind. And the Chinese word for this unification was Chang, as in liver 3, and the Chang Chi and the Tai Chang. And the Tai Chang is that unity beyond the mind in which every individual thing that exists in the full extent of the universe is so implicitly present within every other thing that there is a wholeness beyond the mind's reasoning capacity to make distinctions. And that is also spoken about in Chuang-Tzu as Hun Tun, Emperor Hun Tun, who has no holes in his head and is beyond distinction, a chaos beyond distinction. Hun Tun means chaos, and chaos means a unity beyond the reasoning capacity of the mind to understand. So if we just sit with that emptiness and luminosity, that distinction of absolute ease and absolute attention at the same time, absolute ease and absolute attention, absolute ease and absolute attention. Usually absolute ease, there's no attention, and you experience absolute ease in your deepest sleep when there's no attention. And usually absolute attention, you're trying to get out of a burning building and there's no ease. There's no ease. And the collapse of these two into one is what we would call those unique moments where we're in the zone. And this teaching is a teaching of living life in the zone, not having it being something that spontaneously happens as a miracle and everybody goes, whoa, but actually becomes the context of the basis of our relationship to ourselves and each other. And that is an intersubjective relationship, which is beautifully conveyed in all the dialogues that I've done with the Chinese Medicine Integral Collective, which are all on YouTube for free. And I've done these with Alexandra Love, Laurie Descartes, Randine Lewis, Brant Stickley, Heine Fruhoff, Basanti van Jassingham, and Will Morris. We some combination of those people. We've done about 15 of these and maybe 20 by the time you are actually watching this. So on to the relative dimensions of the self. So first, actually, let me talk about consciousness and the unconscious. When I use the term consciousness, I'm going to distinguish that from mind. We'll go into mind in a little while. Consciousness, when I use the term consciousness, we can say there's consciousness when I talk about Shen, when I talk about self, when I talk about spirit. There can be a large C, a small c, a large S, a small s. The small s, small self, small spirit, small Shen, and small consciousness is the individual's motivation, the motive force within them, their intellectual capacity, their memory, the capacity to store and retrieve information in the form of thought, feeling, emotion, and sensation, the capacity to initiate movement. And this is significant. It works the same in everybody, but it's individual. It's the sense of the self as being separate from and having a destiny apart from the whole. When we talk about Shen, spirit, self, consciousness, large S, I'm talking about Yang with a capital Y. I'm talking about spirit. I'm talking about infinite light. And I'm talking about infinite love. Love and light and spirit as the source of all creation, the path of the journey of all creation, and the ultimate destination of all creation simultaneously. I'm talking about an infinite field of light in which all of existence occurs as an object, and that light itself is one and recognizes no separation, and that light is in every moment coming through everything and everyone. And this is relatively easy to experience in meditation if one understands how to meditate and has received good instruction and followed that instruction sincerely. And it's easy to experience. I mean, taking entheogens, even if you take, a little bit of an entheogen and just go like psilocybin, take just a little bit and go walking in the woods, and all of a sudden you can feel that the forest is just one thing and it's all alive and you're part of it and in no way separate. So the goal would be to have such a deep relationship to consciousness that one has recognized oneself as consciousness. Shifted conscious, a spiritual experience is the momentary to everlasting shift of attention off of small consciousness, off of small Shen spirit and self, onto large Shen spirit and self, and recognized that seen through the sense of separation to experience ourselves as the eminence of and the emergence of that infinite light and love into the world. And then we can experience the ever shining of that radiant light of the sun of the heart through all the clouds and through everything and through everyone all the time. Consciousness doesn't see shadow. It just blows right through it. If you just think of the view you would get if you were sitting at the center of the sun, looking in every direction, all you would see is light. And this is why a lot of gurus with very high state experience, who have deep stabilization in spirit and can transmit it non-duality very deeply as a state, believe that they make the colossal, egregious, deeply regrettable mistake of imagining that they have no shadow, because they can't see it, because they're just looking through the eyes of light. And they've bypassed all of the deeply conditioned biological and culturally conditioned structures in their mind and in their body to maintain a state experience of clear white light. But their expression of that in word and behavior is often grossly distorted by the shadow, which they cannot, will not, and often stubbornly refuse to see. The unconscious is every part of the self that we don't yet know. Part of it is repressed and part is unrepressed. And we'll look more deeply into all of this, of course, but the unconscious is that which you don't know. So if you tell me, I took ayahuasca and I saw that I can be very prideful. Well, that's not unconscious because you see it. If you tell me, yeah, I tend to get defensive when people criticize me, that's not unconscious. You just said it. The unconscious is everything you don't yet know. Part of that is repressed. Repressed means you are burning physiological resources of Jing and Qi and scattering Shen in service of hiding content from yourself. You once knew this content, but you're doing physical work to deny it and keep it from yourself. And that there is a constant tension between the life force trying to bring that awareness and those memories into your awareness, and a conflict between that and all the work that you're doing to repress and keep that from yourself. And that conflict creates any number of symptoms manifest in the body in ways that are predictable through the syndrome patterns of Chinese medicine in the 5-element system as constitution, and all the 5 other syndrome patterns like entry-exit blocks and Akabani imbalances, for instance, and husband-wife imbalances, and all the syndrome patterns in arrogant liver rising and this sort of thing. So part of the unconscious is repressed. We once knew it and then conveniently forgot it and are doing magnitudes of work to hide it from ourselves. And part of the unconscious is not known to us, but we're not doing any work to hide it from ourselves. So you're scared of snakes, not because necessarily, I mean, how many people here scared of snakes are scared of snakes because they got attacked by a snake when they were young? No, there's this, you hear a slither in the grass. I love snakes. I know all about them. I spent a year of my life every week going to a museum and taking a science museum and taking care of all the reptiles in high school. And I love them, and still I can be out for a walk and hear a slither, and I'll just jump because it's just primordial. And once I see it's a garter snake or a corn snake or a milk snake or any non-poisonous snake, you know, I'm instantly good and I know what it is. But before I know, when it's unknown, there is a deep triggered primordial first chakra reflex, survival reflex. Well, I'm not repressing any of the content around why that's so. It was just programmed in over millions of years of sleeping in caves. Similarly, there is part of the self which are the eyes that I'm looking through now, and I can't see the eyes I'm looking through. I can see everything else out there, but I can't see my own eyes. You can't see the lens you're looking through. And the goal of practice and taking a course like this, ideally, the goal is to be able to make the unconscious part of the self conscious. And to be able to see it, to make the subject an object. The subject of the self, currently the subject that I am, in one moment becomes the object of the next more and highly evolved self. And then the last part of the self that is unconscious but not repressed is future potential. You can't accuse a 4-year-old of repressing their capacity for doing geometry. They have the capacity, it's latent, and it's going to emerge in the future. Now, in the adult, we can intuit, we can begin to intuit future and higher potentials, and then we can repress them from coming in. But that we begin repressing them at the moment we begin intuiting them because we're afraid of the sacrifice we'd need to make to manifest that next higher and deeper level of love and care and relationship, or changing our relationship, or changing our job, or moving where we live, or changing our career, or having to rectify some relationship to a person or an institution in life. We begin to intuit it, and then all of a sudden, because the ego can be understood as the momentum to maintain the status quo, we start to actually repress our future. But we only do that at the moment we begin to intuit it. So the repressed part of the self, the part of the unconscious that we that we burn physiological resources for the sake of hiding from ourselves, is what we call shadow. Now on to the relative dimensions of the self. And remember, this is a 10-month course. We're going to go through all these parts of the self. So each module is going to take a look at one of these and go deeply, deeply, deeply into it. The ego is the separate self sense. It's just it's the sense of being a separate self that has a destiny unique apart from the whole. The separate self sense itself isn't a problem. The problem is we can also understand ego as the genetically based and culturally and karmically reinforced habit of maintaining all attention on the separate self sense, so that the sense of being a separate self becomes the center of the self and takes a disproportionate place within the self structure. So ego can be understood as the separate self sense. But if we stop there, there's a problem, because when we talk about the traditions talk about ego death, and we don't want to kill the separate self sense. We want to embrace it with deep love and appreciate it. It's good to have a separate self sense, you know? It's good that, like, when I get up from break now, I'm going to know where the bathroom is in my house. It's good when you go to work every day, you know where you put your car in the parking lot and understand how to get home. You know, it's good to have a separate self sense. The ego that's the problem is the conditioned habit of only knowing ourselves as that, and at any cost maintaining all awareness on the separate self sense as self, so that our identification with it grows and grows and grows and grows, and the ego takes an increasingly disproportionate place within us until we become narcissistic and megalomaniacal and only care about the well-being of that separate self and have no care about anything or anyone else, to the point that all other people in life become two-dimensional cardboard cutouts. And that Donald Trump, the current president, the president of the United States, on the day that I'm making this, I'm hoping he's not still while you're all watching this. But you know, he would be a perfect example of a person who is megalomaniacal and a malignant narcissist, who sees other human beings as two-dimensional cardboard cutouts in his life there to serve his purposes. So the ego as an individuated separate self-sense isn't a problem. It just needs to take a more proportionate place within the self. But we can also refer to ego as the force of habit that maintains our awareness on that separate self sense and forges a soul identity with it. And that's the part we want to get rid of. We don't want to get rid of the separate self sense. We just want to, because that part, that means that we only know ourselves as the self small s. We want to awaken to the self large s, not just in meditation, on a retreat, in a darshan, or when we've swallowed some particular entheogen or done some qigong practice. We want a living experience of all the dimensions of the self all the time, so that we're always embracing all of them. And this is eminently attainable and should be attainable in the context of this course for everyone in it who will sincerely engage in, really, over the course of this class, really contemplating and engaging in the discussion groups and really doing the reading. So that's the ego. The superego is the part of the self that becomes programmed in with the first sip of mother's milk, but explodes as we gain language and culture starts telling us who we are and how we are, and starts interjecting, instilling the rules in our, all the rules and roles of who we are, how life is, and how we're expected to behave for the sake of being able to join the membership collective. If you want to be in this family, this is what we do. If you want to be in this church or this synagogue or this mosque, this is what we do. If you want to be a citizen of this country, this is what we do. And so the content of the superego is all the culturally conditioned agreements for being part of some membership collective. You start to have these agreements in your play group in the sandbox when you're 5 years old, 4 and 5 years old. There's an in group and an out group, and no, Betty and Bobby can't, you can't come with us for Halloween. There's an in crowd and there's an out crowd, and everyone, the ins and the outs, have their rules and have their roles. So that's the superego. The mind orients us in time and space through the storage and retrieval of information. It's an evolutionarily evolved mechanism, wholly dependent on the structural and functional integrity of the nervous system. And it orients us in time and space through the retrieval of memory in the form of thought, feeling, emotion, and sensation. It's impacted by shadow, but has no direct conscious access to it. It can understand, it can come to understand shadow when that shadow is explicated. It can come to understand shadow. The intellect can come to understand shadow as parts of the self, but to the degree a person is unconscious, their mind is just driven by shadow, and they're just completely identified with all the motives of the shadow, thinking that those motives are theirs, not understanding. So we want to separate out the dynamics of shadow and the content of shadow from the mind. So the mind can become a tool orienting us in time and space through a transcendent connection to ourselves as emptiness and luminosity. So we are always looking out into the world of complexity from that fundamental wholeness and oneness. So the psyche, psychology, psyche means soul in the original Greek, but in the subtle realm of the self, we talk about the ego, the superego, the mind, the psyche. These are all in the relative subtle dimensions of the self. Your kneecap isn't the subtle dimension. Your body isn't the subtle. We can weigh it. You can't weigh ego, superego, mind, psyche. These are more subtle. The psyche is the dynamic relationship of the mind's contents, all the thoughts, feeling, emotion, and sensations, to each other. And the dynamic relationship of all the contents to each other that color the mechanism of an individual's meaning making. And that's often compelled by shadow. So becoming transparent, one of the 5 integral imperatives, means to clear up shadow, rectify the relationships of all the components of the mind to each other, so that the mind itself, as a mechanism that orients us in time and space, becomes an object in our awareness that we can see, working, understand its motives from a context, an infinite context beyond it, in which the mind is just finite. Then we have the soul, and the soul is the most subtle, is more relatively more, so the mind is relatively gross. The psyche is more subtle because it's the subtle relationships of the contents of the mind to each other. And then the soul is even more subtle than the psyche. The soul is the interface between the physical body and clear white light. The soul is the most subtle dimension of the self that still retains personal characteristics. The soul has a condition, and that condition is determined by all the choices we and our people have made over history in relationship to our life experience. And the relative condition of the soul, the degree to which the soul is increasingly distorted, is the degree to which the fidelity of the transmission of light is impeded. And the soul's transmission of light is impacted by repression and by shadow. And the goal of transparency is to resolve the shadow and to rectify the soul so the soul can better receive and transmit light, receive light into the body and into the psyche, and receive the light from the heart and the essential goodness and Buddha nature instilled as constitution. One of the Chinese words for constitution, Xing, Xing, translates as something pretty akin to Buddha nature or the authentic self. So then we have conscience is one of the voices within. Conscience is the voice of the soul, speaking to us for its own rectification, for the sake of transmitting light with better fidelity. And we need to learn, we're going to have a whole class on recognizing the difference between consciousness and superego. Superego are all the rules and roles programmed in by culture, some of which are important agreements we need to learn to live by, like the nature, like the inherent sovereignty every human should have over their own bodily autonomy. For instance, conscience is the voice of the soul speaking for its rectification. It's the voice of the soul informing us in real time every moment about the action that needs to be taken, particularly in the face of stress, in order for us to manifest our life curriculum. Conscience is the voice of the soul informing us of our condition relative to our potential. It is the voice of the soul informing us of the gap between the highest that we've seen in life and know and believe to be true and our average state of development and where we're actually living from and as. And conscience is the voice of the soul striving to close the gap between the gross, dead material body and the radiant love of clear white light. I'd like to take a moment and discuss the three realms of experience that I've alluded to earlier in this talk. Every term in Chinese physiology has gross, subtle, and very subtle meanings simultaneously. The problem with TCM as formulated by the communists isn't that it's wrong, it's that it only refers to the gross part of human experience. Every experience we have, we're always experiencing in gross, subtle, and very subtle dimensions of the self. Every Chinese term, phlegm, heat, cold, warmth, dryness, joy, fast, slow, in, out, up, down, every syndrome pattern, every constitution, every statement we can make about an individual, every observation we have about the individual is, and every word we can use in the Chinese language of Chinese medicine to speak about it always has gross, subtle, and very subtle dimensions. The gross realm is the body and the aspects of mind that reflect the apparent ultimate reality of the body in the separate self sense. And this is daylight and waking life. So the gross realm goes from anything we can measure, subatomic particles that could be measured, all the way up through atoms, all the way up through amino acids, to proteins, to cellular structures, to organ systems, all the way up to the individual, physical individual, as well as those dimensions of the mind that reflect to us the apparent separate existence and ultimate reality of every physical thing in creation as a separate and individual thing with its own name and its own destiny. The subtle realm has two dimensions. Well, the gross realm has two dimensions, the physical body and those parts of the mind that reflect to us the apparent ultimate reality of that, the physical body and that which can be measured. The subtle realm has two dimensions, which is the psyche and the soul. And we experience these in dreaming, infantile fantasy, and creative intentional visioning. In the gross realm, a pen is a pen and a cup is a cup and a desk is a desk. And in the subtle realm, in your dreams, everything that presents itself is a metaphor. So a cup could be a cave. A cup could be the unconscious. A cup could be the female genitals. A cup could be a canyon. A cup could be unmanifest, unrealized potential. So in a dream, a cup could be something that you were given by your grandmother as a gift when you were 3 that broke when you were 7 and symbolize the loss of your grandmother or your connection to even the entire female lineage in your family. So everything that appears in a dream has a condensation upon it of many, many, many streams, and everything that appears is a symbol, everything that appears is a metaphor. And so we don't just practice a gross medicine, a science of the body, although TCM tends to see it that way. And certainly Western medicine only sees it that way. We also practice a subtle medicine. And when a patient is speaking to me, there's a constant stream of acupuncture point names, Chinese characters for the meanings of them, Chinese characters for the herbs and the meaning of the different herb names, and I Ching trigrams and hexagrams and Enneagram and any horoscopes and any other system that you've learned. As a person's talking, all these symbols are streaming as an image over time begins to coalesce of a dynamic constituency of the individual and the forces of enlightenment and the forces of repression of that enlightenment within them, the historical forces, the ancestral forces, the social forces, the karmic forces, the physical forces of stasis within that impede the transmission and the flow of that light. From the perspective of the subtle dimension of the self, when a person starts waking up in their dreams, and if a person develops the capacity for lucid dreaming, and if a person starts taking entheogens, they can proclaim, I swallowed this thing and everything I saw was every bit as real as anything that happens in waking life. And I'm sure everyone here has had the experience that they had a dream in their life that is just as real a memory for them as any other thing that actually happened during the bright light of day. I know I've had dreams in my life that are as real memories to me and shaped my life and impacted me every bit as much as anything that happened while I was awake. So a person could raise their hand and say, everything I see in my visions is every bit as real as the chair you're sitting on. And they would be right, 100% right. But just as the subtle realm deconstructs physical waking life, so too does the very subtle realm, which has two parts, deconstruct dreams. So the very subtle realm is the causal, and the causal is spirit. And spirit is divided into witness, which is the lower, because witness is still dual. The witness has two capacities. The witness perceives, and the witness can choose. We're going to go spend the whole class on this. And then beyond, but with the witness, it's still dualistic because there's the witness and what is being witnessed, and that's still two things. And when the witness collapses into what is being witnessed, when the sky comes crashing down into your head, you've been contemplating the wide open sky, and all of a sudden there's no difference between your sky and your head, and everything blows off. That's non-duality. And non-duality is deepest dreamless sleep. And if I ask you, you've been doing this, you're 30 years old, you're 40, you're 50, you're 75 years old, you're 80, you've had three deepest dreamless sleep 365 nights a year for that time period. Please describe your deepest dreamless sleep to me. You can't do it. Why? Because you have never been there. From the perspective of dreaming, your whole life is broken down into a flow of metaphor and symbol, and everything becomes flow. Everything that seems hard and static and concretized becomes a flow of living symbol. But from the perspective of spirit, deepest sleep, where are your dreams? Poof, gone. And that reveals that dreams, while dream time is every bit as real as gross waking life from the perspective of clear, radiant light and love, your dreams are just subtle objects. Your visions are just subtle objects, not hard objects like the desk or that tree or the car out there. Dreams are subtle objects. And they're every bit as real as waking life, and also from the perspective of clear white light, every bit as unreal. Hi, so now I'd like to talk about the forces at work inside. Of course, we can think of shadow as a force and conscience as a force, and that's legitimate. But what I'm talking about are the two great forces that work upon us. And these are Eros and Agape. And you'll read about them in the Dimensions of the Self book to flush them out. We can understand that here we have the 5-element cycle. Here we have the embryo, which is the sense of the self-contained, the snake swallowing its own tail, as the ego just completely wrapped up in itself. And that ego is the wheel of samsara, which is the Sheng cycle, round and round, winter, spring, summer, late summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, late summer, fall. Fear, anger, joy, sorrow, worry, grief, longing, fear, anger, joy, sorrow, worry, grief, longing, cold, wind, heat, damp, dry, cold, wind, heat, damp, dry, samsara, birth in water, death in metal, birth, death, birth, death, birth, death, the endless cycle of incarnation. And we cut that in half. And these are the left-hand pulses, kidney, liver, and heart. And these are the right-hand pulses, the pericardium, spleen, and lung. The left-hand pulses are Jing in water, Qi regulated by wood, and Shen in fire, in the heart, stored in the heart. And Jing, Qi, and Shen are the three treasures and the basis of the authentic self. And this is evolution, the evolution of light through the vehicle. The tree sends roots down into water and the highest branches up toward the sun. And it's the striving of the life force within us toward greater and greater and deeper integrity and deeper knowledge of the self as emptiness and connection to the soul, and higher expressions as the highest tree branches raise up toward heaven. And at the moment of death, the Hun spirit exits through the top of the head, GV20, to ascend back to the North Star and the Big Dipper, the central administration of human destiny, to report on the merit accrued in one's lifetime. This is all the light that we were able to engender in life. All of the stagnation we were able to purify, all of the shadow we were able to purify for the sake of the emergence of transparency and wisdom, humility, righteousness, propriety, integrity, benevolence, all of wisdom, all of the virtues. So this is Eros. Eros is evolution, the striving toward the higher. Eros is the love of the lower toward the higher. And the left-hand pulses have everything to do with the cultivation of light through the vehicle of the body. The right side of the Sheng cycle is the digestive system. The pericardium digests relationship. The earth digests food. And the lungs digest fluid, water. They receive and they take in, and the colon forces down through peristalsis, down through us, the nutrition that we take in. And we have to digest relationship and learn from it. So whereas the left side of the cycle is how the physical machinations and working of the body produce and elevate light through us, the right side of the cycle is how do we take light in through relationship, through food, through water, and through air, and create blood and muscle? How do we create a body out of light? And that's the right-hand side of the cycle. This is involution. Evolution is the transcendence of light and evolution of light through the vehicle. Involution is the influx of light into the vehicle. And this is agape. And agape is the love of the higher for the lower. Eros is the love of the lower for the higher, as evidenced through the striving of the soul toward union with light. And agape is the love of the higher for the lower, evidenced as dare I use the term, God's choice to involve him, her, or itself into matter, forgetting God's own nature and pushing that matter forward for billions of years until matter is able to wake up to remember who and what it is, how it got here, and how to live, recognizing itself as the very thing that made the choice to become. So agape is the love of spirit, the infinite love of spirit manifests through the involving itself in matter and being willing to lose itself for the sake of remembering itself. And eros is the recognition of that self and the striving to manifest that in the world through the true and the good and the beautiful. And this manifests as the striving of the balance of truth and compassion. So eros is rising young, becoming immanence, the evolutionary impulse, the creative impulse, the authentic self, aspiration toward the higher. And it can be distorted into phobos, phobos, which is just bypassing. The distortion of eros is just the constant meditating and taking ayahuasca and tantric sex and all of it just for the pursuit of blissful experience and the focusing on clear white light in a way that denies the presence of shadow, the distortion of the soul, and the necessity of really having to face our own inconsistencies for the sake of rectification. And agape, the embrace of the lower by the higher, is descending yin, and it can be distorted into the death impulse through just collusion and through appetite, through just overeating and over consuming and over acquiring more and more and more goods that just weigh us down. When I teach stream of consciousness. And so I already presented the slide before we even got here. This is the all-important distinction between states and stages. I would request that everyone contemplate this till they really get it and understand. And as you start going through your days, pay attention to the difference between states and stages. One of the most important things is that the state you're at, the state you're experiencing in any moment is always interpreted through the stage that you're at. So yes, you can swallow, a gallon of ayahuasca or 5 grams of mushrooms or, buy a vape pen with 300 hits of DMT and go on a rocket sled to non-duality in 5 seconds. But when it wears off, all of the meaning and everything you saw and everything you learned in that higher expanded state is going to be interpreted through the average level of consciousness that you're actually at, which is why we've had hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of years of people swallowing these things and still find ourselves in the mess we're in today. And in the West, we've had, let's say 65 years of people swallowing psychedelics and relatively little. I mean, the people running the country now are people with a form of consciousness that is ethnocentric and tribal and goes back tens of thousands of years. It's pre-personal, pre-rational form of consciousness is now running the country. So these things can wake a person up, but between waking up and seeing through the material world, there's an awful lot of work to do. That's where the rubber hits the road, and very few of us apparently have a context for actually how to implement what we've experienced in higher states in a way that it makes a deep and impactful and everlasting difference in our lives and the lives of all we're beholden to. I'd like to talk a bit about the discussion groups. The discussion groups that you're having are all being facilitated by people who have some degree of training with me and experience in these groups. This is a new kind of emergent dialogue. It is modeled in the discussions that I've had online with the Chinese Medicine Integral Collective. I would ask you to watch a couple of those on YouTube. Watch some of the later number ones, probably like 10 and up. Because it took a while to really get on board people with the process. Intersubjective dialogue has to do with having a collective discussion, looking into something with creative interest in a group beyond ego. So it's the outer manifestation of what we're trying to engender within the inner collective. We want the union and the harmony that we're trying to engender inside between all the parts of the self so that they exist in dynamic and creative interaction with each other and a deeply loving and creative relationship with each other manifests as a kind of relationship in the world where we begin to listen with new ears and speak from the heart in a very deliberate and very conscious way in all interactions. The Bodhisattva vow says, may there be no insignificant interaction. May every interaction with every individual be significant. We're engendering a kind of discussion where an intelligence emerges in the collective that's greater than any individual's intelligence or capacity within. We're looking for a non-dual experience in a collective where everyone in the collective is interested in what's being discussed and not talking about it, but talking from it and as it in real time from their own perspective. This is jazz. This is music. Dialogue is music being born in the moment creatively in a way that's unpremeditated. And there are certain parameters that will help facilitate this. The first is listen. Listen, listen, listen. Listen from the deepest, quietest, and most engaged, at ease, spacious, interested part of yourself. Listen with the ears that parents listen to the breathing at night of their newborn baby child. Listen with the deepest interest. Listen beyond the mind that has opinions and already knows. We're not interested that when we're discussing soul food, well, this book said this, and my teacher said that, when, well, in my tradition and in my church, the rabbi and the priest and the shaman, they say this. There's space for all that, and of course it all informs. But what we're far more interested in is each individual looking within inside and saying, when I contemplating soul, open into my own soul, this is my experience right here now. There's depth. I experience a care. There's an expectation. There's an imminence. I have space to hear what I don't know. I'm interested, and there's an excitement. I'm anticipating what might come, and it isn't here yet, but I know we can go somewhere new together. You see, that's very different from just, well, Heidegger said, but in contradistinction to Descartes, which of course is quite different from Lao Tzu, and there's room for all that. And obviously, as an author and a scholar, I've appreciated that in my life, but it's just the point is that we have access to all of the same raw material that the people who wrote the classics had access to. And I have always been at odds with the scholars who think that they are the gateways to youth via texts to the real authentic knowledge. I have always endeavored to convey the very mechanism by which a person can, through contemplation, open up to the dimensions of themselves and life experience to have a real lived and unabstract relationship to the nature of medicine as an emergence in real time. So in this kind of intersubjective dialogue, when we speak, we want to speak directly from experience without abstraction. We want to speak from and as that which we are talking about, really looking into our experience of it in real time. Listen in an interested way, build on what the last person has said while the other person is talking. Don't just think about what they're saying, but pay attention to just what is arising within you. Thinking is, should I buy the Volvo or should I buy the Volkswagen? Well, one costs this, the other costs that, or the Kia. One costs this, the others cost that. One gets this mileage, one costs that mileage. I can borrow money at this interest rate for one, but there's that promotion for the other, the resale value, the safety. That's thinking. In contemplation, we ask a question and we just allow content to arise and just pay attention to it without thinking about it, and until we get a aha, I get it. That's contemplation. Intersubjective dialogue is a group contemplation. And one of the things is when another person's speaking, listen with interest and pay attention to what's arising within you. And the shocking thing is that as it takes form within you, say, well, listening to you, what you just said, that's so interesting. And what came up in me was this. And three other people go, oh my God, that's exactly my experience too. Those very words came up, and you start to realize you're all having the same experience and you're all in the same process and you're all awake to the same thing. And this is a deep, deep form of medicine. Intersubjective dialogue is the mirror image of meditation. In meditation, we renounce relationship to the content and quality of consciousness, and we just dissolve into non-being. Here, we come together as individuals, dropping the ego sense to create a living being, a living intelligence, and bring it into the world in a way that we are its sense organs And we are the perceivers and creators and initiators of this being. And it's just a very beautiful, and I used to lead intersubjective discussion groups as I toured the country. And I stopped doing it because some people would get very upset because the only way they could relate to it was as some kind of new age psychobabble. And other people would have profound experiences, but then, I'd leave town at the end of the weekend and they had no way to follow up and didn't know what to do with them. I've had many people come up to me years later and say, I took this course with you and we did this 45-minute exercise on the last day of the weekend, and it just totally changed my life. I've never experienced anything like that. There is great, great potential here. It would be helpful to do these calls on Zoom so you can see each other, but it actually works fine on the phone too. Zoom is preferable so you can all make eye contact and feel that you're with each other, or something like Zoom. Build on what the last person has said, try to take it further. This isn't about agreeing or disagreeing. And it's not about mentioning the past. Oh, yeah, this is just like some experience I had. Or the future. Oh, this is incredible. We could do this. We could do that. We could go. It's just about right here, right now, what's being born. So you each have a group leader, and I'll be in touch with the group leader about how things are going. I just ask that you just give wholeheartedly with deep interest. Don't be shy about participating. If you're not sure what to say, just listen for a while. It's also a tendency is people want to be right and they want to be impactful in the wrong way. The ego has a point to make about something. There's no set order of speaking here, so when someone's done speaking, anyone can jump in. Sometimes there are pregnant pauses, and it's good to let them be for a while. But when someone's speaking, the next person can just like pick it up and go with it. Sometimes there's just quiet. And what the ego wants to do is have something important to say, and then 5 other people speak, and then 8 minutes later, it just wants to insert the thing that it was going to say 8 minutes ago, but everything's moved on, and it's just not relevant. It's going back, and there is no going back. Just forward with this. Here are the assignments. So deepening perspectives is DP is deepening perspectives. Sometimes you'll see ND for readings in Nourishing Destiny. And sometimes you'll read CP for readings in Clinical Practice. So it's good if you own those 3 books because those are references. Most of the readings are going to be in the deepening perspective text. This module has relatively more readings because it's the first one and serves as a foundation, but I'm also sending this all to you 4 to 6 weeks before the course begins, so you have plenty of time to get started. I would like you to contemplate, one, we're used to looking at the one through the eyes of the many. So looking at the one through the eyes of different traditions, what does it mean to look at the many through the eyes of the one? What's the perspective of the one? You'll find that your conscience will tell you. Your conscience is always striving to inform you of what action you can take for your soul to become straight and for you to manifest in the world your deepest, highest, and most meaningful reason for having incarnated in a way that catalyzes the emergence of the true and the good and the beautiful for everything and everyone. And I just want you to get clear, what is your intention on taking the class? And these are good discussion group prompts, but I'll also put a prompt on the webpage for you on the class page. So thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this first module. Please do these readings. Start to really set an intention in what you want to get out of this class, what you're going to bring to it, and start to really contemplate the distinctions I've made. Okay, thank you. Again, I'm just so excited to be here and to work with all of you. It's such a deep privilege. And I commend you for taking a class like this that involves so much more than just learning another technique that you can use on Tuesday morning in clinic. This will really get to the foundation of your entire relationship to yourself, to others, and to clinical practice in a way. This should cause an awakening in a way that everything you already know will come to serve a much, much deeper and higher motive. Thank you for your engagement, and I look forward to seeing you in the Q&A.